His most recent book is The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. Would you please welcome Professor O'Shaughnessy?
I'm grateful to Professor Schulz for his introduction and the Institute for Governance and Civics for this invitation. The revelation for me writing this book is that I cannot think of, and I invite you to challenge me, any other head of state in world history who spent so long thinking about a university. And we'll see he's involved in every aspect of the creation. It's a project that was contaminated by what he called the deplorable entanglement of slavery. And this has been the focus of much current research on the university. I incorporate it in my book. It's not just a celebratory book, but I fear that too exclusive a concern with this obscures the huge achievement and creativity of his ideas. As we'll see, the university had a great impact on higher education in America, including FSU. In fact, there's a direct family connection with FSU. His grandson was one of the founders, Francis Epps. I didn't include it in the book because there seems to be some controversy here as to just how much he was involved in the actual vision of the university. So this was really an incredible achievement. Between the ages of 73 and 83, this gives me hope, you know, that I can still do something. Jefferson physically designed the university. He was helped by two of the first professional architects in America, Benjamin Latrobe and William Thornton. But as we'll see, it's probably one of the most attractive campuses in America and defines, I think, the way a lot of people visualize an American campus. He called it an academical village, and we'll see why in a moment, this notion of a village rather than one big building. All the other universities, like Harvard, Princeton, they were largely just one big building with huge dormitories. He wanted a village of buildings with professors and students living among each other, something that later proved less popular with the professors and especially their wives. He physically conducted the survey of the land to build the university, building on the fact that his father was a surveyor and he had surveying skills. As a bibliophile and an intellectual, he designed all of the courses at the university. This one I rather like. It's a course in Anglo-Saxon. And I put this in because it might seem when I talk later that he'd be a modern advocate of STEM, doing sciences, mathematics, and technology. He thought Anglo-Saxon essential for Americans to study. He also thought the library should be the center of the university, and the library he designed became the second largest university library in America after it was completed. The project also reveals his political skills in retirement, and at times devious political skills. We always think of Jefferson as terribly high-minded. No, he was secretary of the Board of Visitors, and this is his signature at the end of one of their minutes. Nobody ever volunteers to be the secretary of a club or board and to take the minutes. But it's very smart because you realize you get the last word and you get to interpret what people say. He also had a friend in the Senate, Joseph Cabell, who he shockingly manipulated to get this university pushed through. We'll see, it was a deeply opposed idea and was the most costly university in America to build at the time. I mean, it really just comes behind the projects of building Washington, D.C. and the Erie Canal. And Cabell at times was so sick that he was coughing blood on the floor of the Senate. And he wrote to Jefferson saying, "My wife says this is too much for me, it's going to kill me." And Jefferson basically says, "It's your duty," and says, "You can't desert me at this hour." He also held dinners at Monticello for every student. They were usually on Sunday nights. If students had religious objections, they were invited on another day. The great thing is, this is the most documented period of Jefferson's life. So we've got all these wonderful, rich descriptions with which I begin every chapter. And my very first chapter begins with one of these dinners, which his granddaughter, Ellen Coolidge, called Feasts of Reason. And she describes how Martha Jefferson, his daughter, would preside. And Martha Jefferson would rather tease her father. Her father pushed his chair back because his hearing was going. It was the last year of his life that the university opened. And he wanted to see the students talking among each other. And Martha Jefferson would make comments like, "Well, I love novels, and my father hates novels. And I tried to give him a novel by Sir Walter Scott, and he pushed it aside and didn't like it." That clearly didn't give a rise. So she said, "I love commentaries on the English law by Sir William Blackstone." Now, Jefferson thought that was almost treason. He really wanted to ban that book from the college library. He said it would turn all Americans into monarchists. It was the best crib book, if you wanted to understand the English law, which was still being used by American lawyers and is still to this day referred to. But he disapproved of it deeply, and it's difficult to think of Martha relaxing reading the commentaries on the English law, or anyone else for that matter. Incidentally, it was the most popular book in the college library. The students defied Jefferson's views. On his tomb, Jefferson listed his 3 greatest achievements in life. This was the epitaph that he wanted. Author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. And that might look odd. The Declaration stands out so much more. But in some ways, of course, it's about the freedom of expression and ideas, the freedom of religion, and the freedom, intellectual freedom. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that it certainly shows the creativity of Jefferson, but also how important he thought education was for representative government, and how we can profitably engage with his ideas to think of the role of universities today. And because of what I mentioned earlier, the impact. Now, in fact, the university was just the apex of a much broader educational vision, which would have included schools. A first public school system in the world. Even Massachusetts at this time did not have a formally public school system. That had to wait for Thomas Mann in the late 1830s and 1840, although Massachusetts and Connecticut had the most literate population of anywhere in America, because Presbyterians and Congregationalists wanted children to read the Bible. And the other place was Scotland. But if he'd instituted it, and this was a proposal during the American Revolution, it would have been the first in the world. And what is interesting is his objective in founding schools, which he always said was much more important than the university, and he tried many times again afterwards. He wanted people to be able to question government and to engage in civic processes. And I like to contrast that with Frederick the Great of Prussia, who at the same time was putting ideas forward about public education in Europe, and did indeed found the first public school system in the early 19th century, which is somewhat ironic because it was a dictatorship. And the reason Frederick the Great wanted to found schools was because they would make the state stronger, that they would train future bureaucrats. And so he and Jefferson had opposite ideas of why you found a university or schools. Now, like many of Jefferson's ideas, it certainly had its limitations. And so before I talk about what was unique and special, I want to mention those limitations. One is that he never founded any primary schools. People were very critical that he used an immense amount of public money, but it wasn't for the popular education, it was for an elitist project. Another was the cost of the university. It was the highest fees in America after Harvard. And there were meant to be scholarships. They never appeared till 20 years later. Some people have even questioned whether there were really freedom of ideas. There was an overt political agenda behind this. He wanted to turn students into good Republicans, which he thought was the true philosophy of the American Revolution, and not to have them turn out as Federalists. Every other institution in America, even in the South at this time, was dominated by the Federalists, his opposing party, who loathed him and indeed encouraged their students to vote against him. Timothy Dwight at Yale threatened his students if they voted for Jefferson in 1800 and 1804. There's nothing new about politics in the university. And of course, we've mentioned the presence of slavery, over 200 slaves building the university and 200 enslaved people at the university at any time. The middle photograph is Sally Cottrell Cole, who was a personal enslaved maid of Ellen Coolidge, who I mentioned earlier, the granddaughter of Jefferson, and was later sold to the university and became a maid to the professors. Roger Geiger, in his magnificent overview of higher education in America up till 1945, says that the University of Virginia was just a finishing school for the elite planters. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is hopefully show you there's a lot more. Like the Declaration of Independence, it was revolutionary. I was fortunate to write this while working at Monticello, and I oversaw a team of 10 people who were doing nothing but editing Jefferson's correspondence for his later life. It's known as the Retirement Series of the Jefferson Papers, part of the Great Princeton series, which began in 1950 and will not end till the end of this decade. There's so many letters, 19,000 by Jefferson, and almost 4 times as many letters to Jefferson, all of which have to be annotated. And we found a lot of new documents. Some of them were hiding in plain sight. When he set up the university, he produced a blueprint called the Rockfish Gap Commission. And this would be about 30 commissioners from all over the state who would write this blueprint. But what we discovered is he'd already written their findings. In fact, he'd done 3 drafts and had Madison come over the night before they met to just check through it. And this is, I think, reveals just his political canniness, that he could write the report for a committee before it had even met. So these are some of what are really the distinctive features of the university. One is what he called the academical village. The idea of a university is a very personal community in which professors and students lived among each other. He wanted to create his own student days at William and Mary. And these were some of his mentors with whom he used to dine, George Wythe, William Small, the governor, Francis Fakir. And they had marvelous conversations. They had musical evenings in the governor's palace. He wanted to recreate that atmosphere. And the pavilions on either side of what's known as the lawn, they don't call it a campus, those were the professors' houses. I like to point that out now. Of course, now they are the houses of administrators, other than Larry Sabato in political science. But the professors were going to live in these grand houses. And when asked to justify this, he said, you can't have professors from Europe. He was already thinking of recruiting them all abroad, living in shacks. I wish I could make the same argument. However, I think the most distinctive feature of the university was it was secular. And if we really want to think about what Jefferson meant between the separation of church and state, we should look at this as his model. He didn't ban religion, but there were no department of religion or theology, and there was no chapel. That was unheard of. All of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, the center of them was the chapel, not the library. And this was a huge influence on him, not trying to protect slavery in the South or a Southern view. What he felt was that most of America's universities were dominated by one denomination, mainly the Presbyterians, who were headquartered at Yale and who did more than any other group in this period to found universities. But he felt their influence was nefarious. They were hostile to the teaching of science and modern subjects. And he really, I think, went through an epiphany during his period while he was standing to be president, because he was being called by his opponents an atheist. And he really resented this, but it caused him to think a lot about his views on religion. And he started to communicate with this man, Joseph Priestley. And this is when he wrote his first letter saying he wanted to found a University of Virginia. In other words, I see his motive as having religious roots. And it's very interesting that he was simultaneously producing his own edition of the Gospels. And this would today be seen as sacrilegious. I think it would still shock a modern audience that he took 6 copies of the Gospels in 3 different languages and cut them up and cut and paste and produced what he called initially the sayings of Jesus. And it removed all of the miracle stories. He didn't accept the Trinity. He didn't accept traditional Christian doctrine. Today, we might admire this as a rather remarkable hermeneutical. I mean, it does reflect brilliantly on him as a scholar, especially as he's doing this in Greek and other languages, and trying to discern what was authentic. And his argument was he was going back to original Christian thought, and that everything else were just the accretions of time. What I think is significant is that the year the university got a bill from the state, 1819, he went back to that project. He didn't feel he'd done it sufficiently well, and produced this volume, The Life of Jesus of Nazareth, and refined his project even more. In other words, this was something that was dominating his thinking. But the fact that it was a secular university gave him great problems in the legislature, and also caused a lot of students not to sign up. The university was not nearly as popular as he'd anticipated in the early years, and parents were saying they just weren't going to send their children to an infidel place. We got a lot of quotes from them. And a preacher came through a couple of years after Jefferson died. This is quoted in Bill Buckley's God and Man. And the preacher said, after some students had harangued him in the town center, no, God and the devil divided the world, and the devil said to God, you can have it all, I will have this, and put his thumb on Charlottesville. That's the sort of reputation. Another very distinctive feature was the sheer breadth of the syllabus. He wanted a universal. He very deliberately called it a university. A lot of institutions of higher education at the time were called colleges. The notion of a university is offers something much broader and graduate work as well. This was the first university to offer economics. It was an early university in terms of its science offerings, which was still sneered at in many institutions. It had a medical school at a time when Columbia was closing its medical school, and it had one of the earliest law schools. What is remarkable is several years later, Yale produced a report in 1828, basically saying a university education should be the classics and trying to turn the clock back and go back to the sort of Renaissance ideas of a university. It was also remarkable in terms of his ideas on pedagogy. And Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first students. It was the first to set exams. I don't know if we want to be grateful for that. But even more important, and here is where I influenced all of American higher education, and is to me, we were discussing this last night, Professor Creswell, the two of us, that this was the first elective curriculum. Students could choose what they wanted to study. They could essentially do 3 majors. If you'd gone to Harvard at the time, you just took a whole batch of subjects in no particular order. And this goes with Jefferson's idea of choice, that students are old enough to make their own selection. Professor Owens was saying this is still controversial as to whether we should have a real core curriculum. It's an ongoing debate. The fact is, he gave them more choice than you probably have. You didn't have to take foundation courses. You could do your courses in any order. And they also revolutionized the teaching method. They introduced lectures. It may be unbelievable, it is to me, that most teaching was done by recitation, including at Harvard at this time. I've once been taught by recitation. I would not recommend it. Other revolutionary aspects were that the emphasis on student governance, of allowing students to authority over each other and elected student councils. He also wanted students to have individual rooms or rooms for 2 people. They're based on monk cells that he'd seen in Europe. And he did this partly on health grounds. He was obsessed with health and with viruses, and regarded the dormitories as incredibly unhealthy. I think at Hampden Sydney, one of the dormitories had 50 people in it. Another unusual figure was the emphasis on academic excellence and appointment by merit. This would later become most famous at Johns Hopkins, which was founded another 50 years later. This is Robbie Dunglinson. He's known as the father of physiology in America. He was recruited from Britain. There was a lot of criticism at the time that Jefferson had recruited most of his professors from Britain. In fact, there really was only one American, and he was obsessed that whoever taught law should be American. He also believed in the idea of faculty governance, that there would be no president or administration, the faculty would supervise their own affairs. This is George Tucker, first professor of economics and political science at the university, also a novelist who wrote the first scientific novel in America. A very interesting bunch of people. He comes closest to being American, except he was born on Bermuda, but he largely grew up in America. That system lasted till 1900. They now have a president, as you probably know, because the most recent one was just removed. What I also want to emphasize is a sheer creativity in imagination that invites us to think again and think about our own universities. This is a cartoon of what he wanted to do inside the dome of the library. He basically wanted to paint it with a planetarium and then put a huge boomstick in on which a professor would sit on a saddle, showing the students all of the planets. And he would be steered by one of the students, which to me sounds very precarious. Other great ideas was that the university medical school would offer free health clinics to the local population during the week. And one thing I couldn't get more of, and I only found brief references, that members of the public were able to go into the lectures to listen to them. And I have at least one description of women going in to listen to the lectures. So I want to conclude by saying this had a very major impact on America, even on England. What we're looking at is not an American university, it's University College London, which was founded a few years later. And Jefferson sent the Rockfish Gap Commission, the blueprint for the university, to Lord Brougham, who at the time was still just thinking about creating a university. And this university has so many of the features of the University of Virginia, some of which it would have included anyway, but it's the first secular university in England and in Britain generally, the first university in England outside of Oxford and Cambridge, and 2 of the first faculty members were recruited from UVA. Harvard was probably one of the universities most influenced. Josiah Quincy, a few years after Jefferson's death, was on his way to see the University of Virginia immediately after his appointment at Harvard. And he had to stop in Washington because the university was on lockdown. It had a major yellow fever epidemic. It sounds very contemporary, despite the students all being spread out. But other presidents of Harvard, Edward Everett, wrote a critique of the university before he became president. Charles William Eliot, as late as the 1960s, James Brown Conant wrote a book as president of Harvard, calling attention to Jefferson's ideas about education. The founder of MIT, William Barton Rogers, was a UVA graduate, and students from the university were to become leaders throughout America, and the elective curriculum was to spread. I also like to point out that Jefferson, we think of him as so anti-state, anti-government, but here he was recommending people should spend money. And he was recommending state involvement. He preferred the idea of public universities to private universities. And I want to leave you with this last thought, because Jefferson's reputation historically has declined since its peak in the 30s to the 60s. But ironically, he predicted it. And he predicted all of the founders would suffer. And it's a marvelous quote. He says, "We will be regarded like our witch-burning grandparents." And that reminds you how close they still were to the Salem witchcraft trials. And he said that's good, because what he really wanted to push were basic Enlightenment ideas that everything should be about reason and evidence and progress. And if people were progressing and using their reason and using evidence, then the generation before them would seem just reactionary and old-fashioned. And he loved to warn people of the dead hand of the past and to use reason and evidence to improve their society. Thank you.
Time for questions. We won't need to pass on a mic. You ask a question, find me to the question, and speak loud enough so everyone can.
Yes. 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 They did. Madison, I remember John Karminski at Wisconsin saying that Madison was someone who hid his own light under a bushel to shine a brighter light on Jefferson. Madison, along with Cabell, was one of his biggest advocates and helped him a lot. He attended all of the board meetings. After Jefferson died, Jefferson wanted him to be the heir and to become the regent of the university, and he did. Madison basically shared his same view. He relented a little bit on the religious question, which is interesting, because there was such a push to have a chapel. And the Rockfish Gap had said there would be a room at the university where itinerant preachers could come and address the university. And Jefferson resisted that all the time he lived. He said, there are churches on the outskirts of the university. Anyone who wants to can go. And Jefferson always argued, and this also proved true, that having a kind of marketplace of religion and freedom of religion would oddly make for a more religious society. So you look at many European countries, they have an official church, including Britain, where the official religion is the Church of England. If you die, you can't die as an atheist. If you don't give a religion, you're Church of England, which some people would say was very appropriate. But religious attendance in America has always been, the late 20th century, early 21st, has always been higher than America. One of the things I loved is that Madison lived long enough to confront several of the leading figures of the Civil War. So you get the American Revolution meeting the Civil War. And he specifically had a really quite violent debate with John C. Calhoun, who brought up, who's regarded as the father of Southern secession. And Calhoun used Jefferson and Madison as the intellectual basis, especially the Kentucky resolves founded at the height of the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. And Madison said, "You're wrong," which I think is fun because we keep debating the Constitution. We don't have one of the writers just tell us we're wrong, this is what we intended. But it's also a reminder that the writers of the Constitution disagree with each other about its meaning, which is why original intent is so difficult to pinpoint. Yes, Michael.
I greatly enjoyed your talk, and I'd like to ask you that what led you to choose the topic of this book?
Yes.
In the course of writing the book, what surprised you the most?
So I'd largely been working on the American Revolution, and in fact, from a British perspective and a Caribbean perspective. But when I was appointed at Monticello, I read a very short book on the university, and I thought this is a topic I'd love to take up. I mean, it's curious that the history of universities is not pushed much. There's not a huge literature, and in many ways it should be a major branch of the history of ideas. So this was an opportunity really to not only read about Virginia, but to work on and read secondary literature on higher education generally. And you realize how interconnected it was and how important in terms of vehicle of ideas. Although in the 18th century, most ideas were by independent scholars. The Enlightenment figures were not at universities, and universities initially weren't really seen as centers of research. That came later. Jefferson seems to have hoped that professors would do research and produce original work, but his big emphasis was actually on the teaching aspect. The revelation, well, was what I started with, that I can't think of another figure in history. And someone like Frederick Great, who helped found the University of Berlin, but he delegated the ideas and the implementation to others, as you would expect with a head of state. None of them have got the time. John Kennedy was a great advocate of the universities and was supportive in lots of ways, having Nobel Prize winners, a special dinner for them at the White House, and revealing his values as well as in the people he selected around him. But no, we probably never had a president so committed. And that's why I feel academics, although there's much that they've made loathe about Jefferson, still need to engage with him. He's too interesting. And as Stacey said last night, he also summarizes the contradictions of early America. And he forces us to speak about it. I mentioned at dinner that it was interesting to me that the two most popular biographies of founders in the last 20 years, one was of John Adams by David McCulloch, and the other was of Alexander Hamilton. And what intrigues me is that neither of them are really contaminated by slavery. It's almost as though we're looking for other founders and a way to avoid the subject. But what is also fascinating is neither was so enthusiastic about the democratization of America. Most of them, as Gordon Wood points out in the radicalism of the American Revolution, most of them were very disenchanted by the American Revolution by the end of their lives and felt things had become too popular and that society was breaking down. Jefferson always remained incredibly optimistic, even though he had a fairly pessimistic view of human nature. He just felt the people get it wrong, but they'll also self-correct and ultimately get it right.
I'll jump in with the next question. So you mentioned the Prussian model that was being pushed forward, and many people in education will look and say that we have adopted a Prussian model of K-12 education, or we had adopted a Prussian model. So I guess my question is, which vision do you think won out? Or are they still battling between the Prussian model and a Jefferson model?
America especially has been much influenced by German education, the university system. Fraternities and sororities are very much an import from Germany. And Germany had, ironically, the greatest higher education system in the world for much of the 19th and early 20th century. And, you know, when people talk about the way the university failed to address slavery, we shouldn't always think that universities hibernate the best and most progressive ideas, because the German universities have great responsibility for the extreme nationalism and vehement xenophobia that was to be an important background to the 1920s. The schools, undoubtedly, it's an influence. And the American system, though, it does become quite distinctive. And again, I think it's freedom of choice and the fluidity and the informality. German education is very hierarchical. I remember once smiling in front of a German scholar while giving a paper, and he leaned across to me and said, "In Germany, we never smile," during our talks. Actually, I've known a lot of German scholars since. He was part of a much older generation, but it is more rigid. A good example is many fewer women in higher education in Germany. And at the moment, you know, you have to do 2 doctorates. And you have to really wait your time and be an instructor for decades. I'm not sure why it attracts anyone. A lot of their best scientists have gone to England and America because it's science, especially, people need a lot of autonomy very early on. They're doing their freshest and best work.
Thank you. I'm curious, as Jefferson founded this University of Virginia, was it primarily the vision this is a university for Virginians, or early on were there people from other states coming?
Yes, so he wanted it to be a national university. He was very jealous of Yale. Yale had the biggest and most diverse student body in terms of geographical region, especially the Midwest. And there was no such thing as in-state and out-state tuition, even though the state was paying for a quarter of the university costs, and at times much higher. Whereas today, I think it's probably less than 3 or 4%. But it never succeeded in being that. It really did become a university of the South. And one of the other revelations of the book for me is some of the most interesting work and universities were in the South in the early 19th century, even the University of South Carolina, North Carolina. These were America's first public universities. They were the first to be very heterodox in sort of religion and encourage religious freedom. And that all starts to change. And one factor is that at the beginning of the 19th century, it was the North which was the buckle on the Bible Belt. And the evangelization of the South occurs later. And it's taking place while Jefferson's founding the university. So he encounters a lot more opposition than he expected. And a lot of these universities revert to something a lot more traditional, like the University of Transylvania, an incredible place for science and medicine in Kentucky. I had to learn this because someone said, "Have you looked at Transylvania?" I fortunately bit my tongue and didn't stupidly ask, "Why would I look at Romania?" You know, that the Presbyterians took back control of it. It became much less progressive. university. That was Madison and Jefferson's fear. It was not so much religion, that the denominations would want complete control, and that this would be suffocating ultimately.
I thought what you said about the chapel intentionally not being included, reflecting one of the tenets of the First Amendment, was interesting. I was wondering, is there anything else in the University of Virginia, in either its architecture or intended structure, that reflects anything about the Constitution or First Amendment tenets?
I suppose he regarded the whole thing as sort of reflecting the system of government. Not only was all the architecture classical, and of course that was part of the inspiration for the Constitution, drawing on Roman and Greek classics, and he wanted the university, the students, to learn the different orders of architecture from the classical world just by walking around the university. So it's a sort of lesson in itself. But also putting reason in the form of a library and evidence at the center of it, and the whole idea of an educated elite who were not only expected to question government, but also to be virtuous leaders, by which they meant at the time putting aside your own self-interest, the interest of the public. Jefferson was enough of a cynic to know that most people are not going to do that. He was a great believer that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is why politicians always need to be held in check by the electorate.
So, my understanding is that there were state universities throughout the state, or maybe 2 or 3, prior to the founding of UVA. There's some debate over which predated.
Yes, Georgia and North Carolina, but Georgia was just a charter, and North Carolina was actually founded.
Yes, yes. So, and I attended South Carolina.
Yes.
My question, which is, what influence, and you had answered this partly, what influence did those existing universities of structures that you had mentioned that those universities were somewhat heterodox already prior to what I think was the evangelization of the South?
Yes.
So was Jefferson, you've emphasized the innovativeness of Jefferson, but was he copying anything to the South with the founding?
Well, actually, he was largely ahead of them, but one thing they shared in common was not only being public universities, but teaching the sciences and not requiring a classical curriculum. William and Mary had already introduced the elective curriculum and had introduced the first law school and the first mathematics professor, but he initially thought about just reforming William and Mary, then realized he was never going to get the Episcopalian Church completely severed. He tried and couldn't succeed legally, and so he reverted to his plan. He even tried to close William and Mary and use the money for the University of Virginia, and he was thrilled when they were thinking of removing themselves and going to Richmond. He said to Madison, once we can get them on wheels, we can just take the whole pile with us. And unfortunately, he was never succeeded in that effort. South Carolina, one of Joseph Priestley's protégés, became one of their first, one of their early presidents, William Cooper. And Cooper was close to Jefferson, and Jefferson wanted to appoint him to the faculty. It was the first appointment he wanted to make. He was from England, a refugee of the 1790s with Priestley. And Jefferson was even willing to make him president of the university and break with his plan as a way of enhancing his salary. And he did appoint him. And the board vetoed it because there was such opposition from the legislature, and they realized if he was appointed and remained, it was going to destroy the funding of the building of the university, Cooper was a Unitarian, like Priestley. And it's very interesting to me that he was able to go to South Carolina and successfully operated. But what is also interesting to me, and again, I think there's a lesson here for academics, Cooper had been very anti-slavery when he was in England and was very much a progressive radical. I mean, it was the radicals who were getting out of England, people who supported the French Revolution, were trying to, and Priestley's labs were burnt by a mob, and Priestley is regarded as the first to do major experiments in oxygen and so forth, an important scientist. They got out, but once he got to South Carolina, not only did he become pro-slavery, but he also essentially preceded Calhoun in this notion of secession. And this was a trend I noticed with a lot of the faculty. And George Tucker was anti-slavery, he'd been born in Bermuda. And Tucker even freed his own enslaved people, but Tucker ended up supporting the Confederacy. And I was going to say, when I talked about religion sort of narrowing the gap, where I think slavery does play a role ultimately, you know, a lot of societies have thrived intellectually with slavery, including Athens during the classical period. Aristotle, Plato, and others were all writing against a background of slavery and approved it. But no, after a while, the university found it more and more difficult to appoint faculty. The first Jewish professor in America was Joseph Sylvester from England, who interestingly had been at the University College London, taught by former UVA professors. And there's no doubt he confronted anti-Semitism, because we've got the Presbyterian paper denouncing his appointment, along with that of a Catholic, reminding us that having Catholics was also controversial at the time. But Sylvester didn't last long, and it wasn't because of religious bigotry. He was violently anti-slavery and got into a fist fight with a student and left. Incidentally, he was brilliant. He introduced the Hebraic language into mathematical language. He was the person who did the first graph, and later became the first, one of the first professors at Johns Hopkins, and ended his days as professor at Oxford and New College.
I'll take the liberty of the last question.
Yes.
So colleges today, universities today have really become a lot about job preparation.
Yes.
We're seeing disciplines in the humanities, especially history,
Yes.
drying up at many universities. You have some young people in here who may be interested in pursuing history as a career. I'm curious what advice you might give.
Well, the point is, you can always go into do a business MBA later. That these are very good foundational courses. Both my brother and father were professors of business, but neither of them regarded it as an intellectual training, a mind training. They all were great believers in the humanities and social sciences, and so was Jefferson. Jefferson said nobody should just study law, and that was really his background. He'd been a lawyer, and he had recommended several years of what was basically a liberal arts education, studying history and other subjects and a language before actually going into law. So on the other hand, you know, some of us can go to the extreme opposite and really sneer at any kind of vocational training. And Jefferson was not in that camp. He was not an academic snob. In fact, he wanted artisans on the campus applying their trade for students to learn it. And he did feel that students should be able to do things for themselves. And originally, before it became the idea for the University of Virginia, it was something called Central College. And he had a plan for night schools so that people working could go to night schools, and he wanted to make vocational training part of it. And we shouldn't forget that even the earliest form of universities were basically giving a vocational training. And they're now regarded as less vocational, but theology was the biggest job market in Europe with all those Catholic priests and different orders. The classics was also a great vehicle for going into the church and into the state. They accepted the notion even then of a vocational training. And obviously, people have to have the means to live. But what I think is it so enriches your life if you've gained a habit of reading and an enjoyment of intellectual ideas, and will make you that much more critical and valuable in whatever job you do.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you all so much. If you need another sandwich or some more food, feel free to grab some. Like I said, we have lots of other events, so please pick up our flyers if you didn't already. Thank you all. Have a great day.